And so it begins here at Norfolk General Hospital. Welcome to part 2 of my vlog about my journey through this particular health crisis in regards to my cardiac health. I want to mention at the beginning of this particular video that I am relying almost exclusively on Laura's recollection of events, as I was sedated for a good portion of it, and being ill, I just didn't have the best memory. I hope I get details correct, but I apologize up front if I've forgotten something or messed it up a little bit here and there. My journey through this terrifying experience began on January the 17th. By evening of that particular day, I began to feel pretty poorly. I didn't have a fever yet, but I was very achy and feeling just run down. And I noticed also that the location where the defibrillator was inserted was hot to the touch. Anyway, I assumed that I had some sort of bug. Well, I did have a bug, but some type of flu virus, and thought that some sleep would make me feel a lot better. So I simply went to bed. On Saturday the 18th, I was still feeling pretty achy, but I was managing okay. And Laura had to go to the store because she was on call or on duty that day. And we noticed that the location where the defibrillator was inserted was no longer hot to the touch. So we thought, well, things are okay, and she could go to work that day. It was a snowy day, we remember that, and at one point she released her worker to go home early because it was really coming down that day. But I was just achy all day and just felt horrid. The real trouble began on Sunday. When I awoke Sunday morning, I was feeling not great, but well enough to try and preach that day. So I went to church and I preached and led worship, but at the end of it, I just felt horrible. I was tired, I was feeling very weak, and a touch of nausea. On the way home, I was so nauseous that I had to have Laura stop the car and let me out at the corner by the church there so that I could throw up. I was just feeling so miserable. We went home and I began to have what I call the shake and bake. I was beginning chills and shakes and feeling just horrible more and more. And the fever began. It was small or light at first, but it began to grow over the next few days. Laura also discovered that day that she had some sort of little bug, flu or cold or something, and we just figured that she picked it up from me. The fever really kicked in as the evening went on, and finally we were able to get some rest. On Monday, I was still not feeling very good. In fact, I felt so poorly, there was no way I was going to work that day. And even though I began the day feeling pretty fine, it got worse and worse as the day went on. It's a funny thing, I had a bit of a fever in the morning and then nothing in the afternoon. I felt pretty feverless, but by the evening it kicked in big time. Laura was still not feeling great, so she decided to stay home, and it's probably a good thing that she did. I wasn't doing very well. By the nighttime, the fever really kicked in. and I was running a fever of 40.5 by midnight. And the chills and the shakes were just horrific. I started a little pattern. I would get the chills and the shakes really bad, and then the fever would hit. It was kind of like chills, fever, and then, chills, shakes, and then the fever. At 12:30, I was feeling so poorly that Laura called the ambulance because she just couldn't get the fever down. Tylenol just couldn't cut it. It just wasn't doing anything. The ambulance attendants, the paramedics arrived and assessed me and decided, yes, we need to get this gentleman to the hospital. And so they loaded me up and drove me to Norfolk General. The funny thing was that it was very cold that night, and yet I just loved it. It was the cool air really made me feel good because it cooled my body down. On the way to the hospital, my fever lessened a little bit, and I felt a tiny bit better. But before Laura could get to the hospital where I was in emergency, Dr. Sinkowski, who was on call that night, had given me Advil. This was a bit problematic because Advil is not really good for people with a heart condition like I had. So anyway, Laura questioned her about it, but she said that the Advil was okay occasionally for people in my situation. The good news was that as they put me into my own room to isolate me because they didn't know what I had, the Advil kicked in and I sweat like nobody's business. The bed was just drenched, but I felt loads better. I really felt just terrific from what I had been feeling. When asked about what was going on with me, the doctor insisted, Dr. Sinkowski insisted it was the flu. But it was odd because I didn't have a cough, nor were any nose. I had nausea, but no diarrhea, which was the common condition that went with influenza A, which was the one floating around in Simcoe area at that time. When questioned about it, she claimed that I'd never had the flu before, if I had never had these experiences before. That the flus I had before were kind of lighter versions or something, or mutated versions, and this was the real deal. I found that somewhat difficult to believe, as did Laura, that I had never had the flu. I probably had it several times through my years, and it was an odd thing to say in my mind. At 4 a.m., she suggested that I go home, and so Laura got me home about 5 o'clock in the morning, and we both tried to get some rest. On Tuesday, the chills and the fever returned. Laura was scheduled to go to Brantford to pick up her bread order for the store, but was a little unsettled about leaving me alone, and so she arranged with Jordan to pick up the bread order and bring it to the store as he was on his way to work out at Langton. I was not coping with the Tylenol, so Laura went to the pharmacy and got some Gravol and some Advil, because Advil seemed to be the only thing that could break this fever. And I had the nausea. It was coming on, and I just couldn't hold food down. Even water was somewhat difficult to drink. But by afternoon, again, like it did in the day or so before, I had no fever in the afternoon. Everything calmed down. But in the evening, another burst, the worst yet, the shaking and fever, etc. Wednesday, again, things weren't good. I was still having fever and chills and shakes, mostly in the morning. I had my lethargic nature was getting worse. I was having trouble even standing up to go to the washroom or anything else. I had no energy. Laura was insistent that we call the ambulance again, but I was somewhat reluctant. I don't tend to want to bother people, and so I thought, well, we don't really need to do that. But at some point, either she or me or one of us suggested that we take my blood pressure. I have a home blood pressure monitor, and when she took my blood pressure, we knew we were or I was in a crisis. My blood pressure was at 87/49, which is terribly, terribly low. I knew in the midst of this that I was in real trouble. In fact, I voiced it to her. I said, I'm in trouble here. I'm not doing very well." So the paramedics came at 11 a.m. and picked me up again, drove me to Norfolk General Hospital. When by the time I got to the hospital, because I was so severely dehydrated, I'd been through at least a couple of bags of fluid. And by the time I got to ICU, I'd had 4 bags of intravenous fluid just to try and keep my blood pressure up, and also to keep my kidneys from going bad. In fact, they were worried that the dehydration would lead to kidney failure. The ER doctor, and I can't remember his name, and I apologize for that, he made an initial assessment and discovered that I had a heart rate of 140. And for someone with HOCM, heartbeat of 140 is deadly. Also, he discovered that I had an AFib, which is an irregular heartbeat in the top part of the heart, and that's also troublesome. Because of all the things that were going on with me, he knew that I needed some specialist help, and so he called the internist on call. Dr. Kumanowski from Norfolk General was on call that day, and he came down and he assessed me and immediately determined that I needed to go to ICU, which is what happened to me. I was admitted to ICU at Norfolk General, and after I got settled for a bit, Laura was able to go home and do some things. And a little later, she came back to the ICU. In the meantime, they had been periodically putting bags of ice around me to try and bring my fever down because it was just raging. When Laura came back, I told her that she'd missed a real show. I had one of my shaking episodes and it lasted for 45 minutes. And my fever spiked and my heart rate spiked to 170 beats per minute, which is horrible. Very scary stuff. In the meantime, they had also insisted that I sit up straight, my body at a 90-degree angle, to keep my breathing at a good rate and to ease the stress on my lungs and my heart. But all I wanted to do was lay down. I was wiped out. I just wanted to lay down, go sleep. Eventually, they let me recline a little bit, and I went to sleep. So Laura was able to go home about 2:30 in the morning to try and get some rest and make some calls, etc. And as she went home, my heart rate was back to 140. So she thought, well, maybe I'm a little stable for the moment. This was on Thursday, the 23rd. Or sorry, not the 23rd. This would be, oh dear, I can't remember which day that was. Where were we? Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, I guess. Now that I've got my calendar straight, the next little portion was Thursday. As I mentioned, Laura had gone home at 2:30, and my heart rate was 140. At 8 a.m., Dr. Naz called her. Dr. Naz is my primary cardiologist who's stationed here in Norfolk General Hospital. Wonderful man, terrific guy, and terrific doctor. And he informed Laura that he was now involved in my case, which made both of us feel a lot better. he informed Laura that I didn't have the flu. I don't know how he figured that out, but he knew I didn't have the flu. I think at some point they had given me an echocardiogram, and he realized from that test and some other things that I had a heart infection, a nasty one. He also concluded somehow that the infection was introduced to my body through the leads of the defibrillator that was inserted into my body, probably because of the proximity of time to when I had it. He was concerned with the violent nature of this particular infection, that it might lead to multi-organ failure, and things were not good. Laura came back to the hospital first thing in the morning, and the decision was made that I needed, for my own survivability, to be sedated and also to be intubated to ease my breathing. So, as I said, I was unconscious for most of what happened for the next few days. As I was in ICU, Dr. Naz informed Laura that I needed more significant help than Norfolk could give me. So he suggested that I be transported to Hamilton General, where there's a very extensive cardiac ICU and medical team. However, when he made the first call to Hamilton General, there was no beds available. And it meant I had to remain, and it would be at least 24 hours before they could take me to Hamilton. This was troubling because I was in a real crisis. Anyway, Dr. Naz, on my behalf, continued to contact Hamilton General to insist that I needed this space badly, and I was in real trouble. And because of his contacts down there, he trained down there actually, and was able to get me a bed in the cardiac ICU down in Hamilton General. So they loaded me up. They put me in an ambulance with 2 nurses and a technician, and I was all wired up and tubed up, and I don't remember anything about it, but they shipped me down to Hamilton. I should mention, in the midst of this, because they thought I had the flu, they were very concerned about exposure to my children and my grandchildren. So my kids weren't allowed to visit me because they didn't want them to get the flu, but Laura was able to keep them up to date with phone calls. Same with my parents and others, her mom particularly, and others. In the midst of this, particularly on the Thursday, Laura says that she made the best decision of this crisis for her, in that she reached out to our neighbor, friend, and fellow church member, Cindy Rapley, who immediately came to the hospital to be with Laura in the ICU waiting room. Cindy became a rock for her, and as many of you know, she ended up being our contact person. We sent, or Laura sent updates to her, and she was able to pass it along to others. Also at that time in the hospital, Marie Knox was there with her daughter getting some medical tests, and she learned of my situation, and she too came up to the waiting room to support Laura. Wendy Squires was contacted. She immediately began prayer links and got people praying for me, arranged for people to involve themselves in a prayer vigil in the sanctuary at the hospital. I must tell you that we're very grateful for the support of this wonderful group of people who came and prayed for us. And I know many were praying at home, and I learned later that there were people as far away as the Caribbean praying for me in this crisis. So again, my heartfelt gratitude to all of you. What comes next in the next video is challenging to share with you. It's a bit. This is where the fear and the anxiety really comes to its strength. It's when I'm in Hamilton. I met some wonderful people down there, had great staff that looked after me, but it was still a pretty difficult journey. So next time when I meet with you, I will tell you about the first stage of my time at Hamilton General. In the meantime, thank you for listening and uh, hearing my story, and may God bless you and keep you well during this COVID situation.